Yeah, it's like, oh, Kimberly's on it, and your mom's like, oh. Okay. So right now, what I'm working on a sequel to my novel Birthright, which people have been crying for a sequel forever, and I sincerely apologize to everybody for it taking so long. And you would think with 2 years of staying at home on the couch with COVID, I'd have it done by now, but no, unfortunately not. Um, but hopefully, late summer, early fall sometime, I'll have War Machines out and ready to go. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to read at least the prologue. We'll see how much time we've got for more. But this is the beginning of War Machines. And there's a Russian character in here, so forgive my terrible Russian accent. Черт! Anatoly Kushnerov swore. He wiped his brow with an already soaked paisley handkerchief, then tossed the cloth onto his cluttered workstation and squinted at the monitor. Strange, glowing orange glyphs scrolled steadily past. With a chewed pencil between his trembling fingers, he consulted his notebook, comparing his notes to the strange symbols. He paused to take a drink of cold black coffee from a dented paper cup. A single bare bulb hanging above his head flickered, and he looked up as the wire hanging from the steel beams above swayed to the left. A long, mournful groan reverberated throughout the ship. The seas were choppy today. Anatoly hoped it wouldn't get as rough as it had after he'd first arrived. He'd puked his guts out that day until there was nothing left to bring up, but that hadn't stopped his body from trying. How many days had he been here? With no windows, who could tell? He slept when they permitted him, ate when they remembered to feed him. Time had no meaning anymore, and yet Anatoly couldn't shake the feeling that his was running out. Again, he wiped his brow. Is there a problem, Dr. Kushnerov? Said a voice in broken Russian. Startled, Anatoly knocked over his cup, spilling the last dregs of his tepid drink onto his notebook. He hastily swiped the moisture from the top page, turned in his chair, and looked into the scarred, sneering face of a short, barrel-chested Asian man with a long mustache. The man's hand rested on the pommel of a curved broadsword hanging from his hip. Of course there is problem, Captain Suk, Anatoly said. This code, he waved his hand at the monitor, is impossible. I have no frame of reference, no way to decipher its meaning. I do not understand. Your understanding is not required, Suk said. You are simply to put that into that. Suk pointed to a hulking machine standing nearby. The robot stood on two legs which terminated in clawed bird-like feet. It was easily as tall as two men, with long arms equipped with sharp claws. As if the clawed hands weren't enough, each arm was equipped with a .50 caliber minigun. The robot's front panel had been removed, and wires hung from the inside of the carapace, wires which were connected to Anatoly's computer. I do not know how, Anatoly shouted. He stood and took a step toward the Mongol captain, but the chain cuffed to his ankle kept him anchored to his workstation. Suk smirked. Anatoly's shoulders slumped. Your own people could not make it work, he said. What makes you think I can? Your credentials. I have never seen anything like this in my life, Anatoly shouted. This program, this code, this language is all unknown. You're saying you're useless to us, Suk said. Niet, Anatoly blurted. He swallowed and took a deep breath before continuing. I am saying nobody in the world uses program like this. Not in government, military, or private sector. This is besmyslenie, gibberish. It has a function. Oh, da! Anatoly laughed mirthlessly. Da! It has function. His fingers flew across the keyboard. Finally, his index finger stabbed the enter key, and he turned toward the lifeless machine. Suddenly, the robot straightened, rising to its full, imposing height. Suk scowled and stepped back as its arms jerked and servos whirred. Hydraulic pistons hummed as the robot placed its left hand against its hip, then raised its right arm straight out to the side. I'm a little teapot, short and stout, the robot growled in a tuneless, synthesized voice. Here is my handle. Here is my spout. The cannon mounted to the right arm barked once, emitting a single burst of flame from the barrel. Sook flinched as a new hole appeared in the hull, identical to a dozen others in a tight cluster nearby. A new beam of sunlight streamed into the cargo hold. Said a voice. Bad monkey. Anatoly swiveled his chair and looked at the monitor. On screen, an animated face smiled. The character was male, blonde, and its blue eyes twinkled as it smirked and waggled a disembodied finger. You should know better than to play with Daddy's toys, the face said. A loud sizzle emanated from the computer tower, and thick smoke billowed from the vent holes in the casing. The face on the monitor winked, and then the screen flickered and went black. A moment later, the display turned blue, and the words, "No signal," appeared. The robot slumped back into its neutral, offline position, its claws clattering against the steel floor grates. Anatoly turned to Sook and gestured to the smoking tower. You see? Motherboard, fried, just like others. Sook scowled and exhaled slowly, ignoring the acrid smoke wafting between the two men. It would help if I knew where this code came from, Anatoly said, before I waste time destroying 12 more computers. I'm afraid that would offer no insight, Doctor, another voice said. Sook snapped to attention, and Anatoly saw the fear in the captain's trembling eyes. Anatoly's host entered the room. Temujin smirked, causing one side of his long mustache to hang lower than the other. He wore a dark brown fur cloak over red and gold silk robes. Atop his head, he wore a traditional Mongolian hat made of fox fur, crowned with a black horsetail. His eyes were dark and penetrating. Anatoly didn't like looking at them. To Temujin's left stood his ever-present attendant, General Chaloon, a tall brute with a bald head and a permanent scowl. The general wore a sword not unlike Sook's, along with a brown leather patch over his left eye. Sook bowed his head. Lord Temujin. Besides, Temujin said, ignoring the captain, I doubt you would believe it. Anatoly began to speak. Look, Chaloon growled at the Russian. Forgive me, Lord Temujin, Anatoly said, bowing slightly. But I do not understand how this code is supposed to translate into that. He gestured over the warlord's shoulder, but Temujin didn't look away. Another of the robots, which these people called Death Walkers, stood at attention beside the door. One of its gun turrets pointed at its disassembled sibling. The other pointed at Anatoly. The robot was ready to put down Anatoly's test subject at a moment's notice, as well as Anatoly himself, should anything go wrong. So what you're telling me, Temujin mused, approaching the disassembled Deathwalker, is that even though we are able to successfully reproduce the Replodian's design down to the last formidable detail, copying its operating system is impossible? Replodian, Anatoly's brow furrowed. I do not know this word. Temujin stroked the robot's carapace. I'd be shocked if you did, Doctor. Without knowing language program is written in, I cannot isolate lines of code that control copy protection protocol, Anatoly said. I am sorry, Lord Temujin. As am I, Doctor, Temujin said, turning his dark gaze to the Russian, because I fear your time with us has come to its inevitable end. Anatoly stared into the warlord's eyes, unable to resist their pull. His eyelids drooped lazily as he bent to pick up the pencil from his workstation. Slowly, he placed the dull pencil lead to his throat against his carotid artery. Temujin smirked. I'm sure you get my point. Da, moi Khan, Anatoly said. Anatoly made no sound, nor did he falter in his movements as the pencil pierced his skin. Sook's lips curled in disgust, and Chaloon looked away as the Russian's body collapsed onto the floor. Temujin stepped over the body and addressed Sook for the first time. For your sake, Captain, he said, I hope you have good news to report. Training continues, my Khan, Sook said, and the recruits are improving by the day. However, Sook swallowed. There was no lying to Lord Temujin. A gifted telepath of immeasurable power, he could pluck the deepest secret from the recesses of any man's mind, but he preferred to hear the truth from one's own lips. He detested using his power to root out deception and half-truths. However, Sook said, reaction time is still unsatisfactory. The Deathwalker pilots simply are not as fast as their autonomous counterparts. Temujin frowned. So you're saying the aliens' robots are superior to your men? That stung. Sook tensed. No, my Khan. My men are... Temujin raised his hand, silencing the captain. Save your excuses, Captain. A solution has already presented itself. Ready a squad of your best men from those remaining. Tomorrow we make landfall. Sook nodded. Yes, my Khan. As he cleared the threshold with Chaloon on his heels, Temujin called, and have that refuse thrown overboard. Sook looked down at the Russian's body and gritted his teeth. Yes, my Khan. Chapter 1, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. 911, what is your emergency? There's a man here with a gun, a female voice shouted over the line. Ma'am, what is your location? The dispatcher said with practiced calm. The caller ignored the question. Instead, she shouted, Kids, get behind my desk. Hurry, get under the desk. High above the bustling streets, atop the tallest building in the city, a lone figure knelt on the edge of the rooftop, his body encased in gleaming blue and gray armor. At the caller's panicked order, the helmet jerked up, the mid-morning sun glinting off the black visor stretching across the faceplate. Strong, gloved fingers gripped the masonry, sending crushed fragments raining down from the eavesdropper's roost. He heard loud popping over the line, 3 shots in quick succession, small arms fire. Children screamed, their shrill voices temporarily distorting the audio. Ma'am, the dispatcher repeated with more urgency, what is your location? Before the caller could answer, numbers and letters crawled across the inside of the visor. 317 East Franklin Ave, Southwest. A green map of the city flashed across the man's vision, which quickly zoomed in on the call's source. A moment later, a full-color photo confirmed what the eavesdropper had already guessed. Bradbury Elementary School, the caller said, followed by another shot, this one much closer than the last. The woman's voice dropped to a whisper. Oh, God, he's right outside. Police are on their way, the dispatcher said. Please stay on the line. They won't get there in time, the man in the suit said, his voice synthesized. He stood and pushed off the building. Jets of flame exploded from his ankles, blackening the rooftop and sending pulverized masonry tumbling down as he surged to the south. Command, the man said. This one's mine. The response was immediate. A male voice said, Acknowledged, Unit 003 is inbound. Another voice, soft with a hint of a French accent, cut in. Try to take him alive this time, would you? No promises, kid. The operator was saying something, but Kelsey Bowden didn't hear her. Somewhere in the building, someone had pulled the fire alarm, and a piercing, rhythmic klaxon assailed her ears. The children huddling behind her whimpered and wailed as the door handle jiggled. Something heavy slammed against the door, and their cries became screams. Kelsey looked over her shoulder at the terrified, sobbing faces. Her desk offered little protection, but it would at least shield some of her kids. The door thumped again, and she jumped, feeling fresh tears burning in her own eyes. The phone fell from her fingers, and she bent to retrieve it. A work boot kicked through the narrow window alongside the door, sending hundreds of tiny glass shards into the room. The phone forgotten, Kelsey stared as an arm snaked through the rough hole in the glass and felt for the lock. She wanted to run over and grab the arm, push against the door, anything, but no matter how much she willed them, her limbs were frozen and heavy. All she could do was watch as pale fingers turned the lock. The arm retreated back into the hallway, and Kelsey watched the handle turn. The gunman threw the door open, banging it against the adjacent wall. He stepped inside, a black semi-automatic pistol in his trembling right hand. The man was short, thin, and balding, Only a few thin strands of black hair clung to his glistening forehead. His dark eyes swept the room and locked onto her. Kelsey felt a startling pang in her chest as she recognized the sweating assailant. Donnie Willitson, the janitor. "No," she said, shaking her head. Fresh tears welled in her eyes. "It's all your fault," Donnie slurred. He was drunk. Kelsey held up her hands. "Donnie, listen." "No, you listen." The shout coaxed renewed whimpers from behind the desk. Donnie pointed his gun at the desk. "Shut up!" he roared. Kelsey choked back a sob, not daring to take her eyes off the gunman. "It's okay, kids." The rage melted from Donnie's face, and he blinked away tears. "Why?" Kelsey swallowed. She knew she had to keep him talking. "Why what?" "You got me fired," Donnie said, pointing with the gun. "Why?" She opened her mouth, but he didn't wait for her answer. "I was nice to you," he said, taking a step toward her. "I sent you flowers. Didn't you like the flowers?" She nodded. "They were very nice flowers, Donnie." "Then why?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "We worked together. It wouldn't be appropriate." "Oh, that's crap," he shouted, thrusting the gun at her. Kelsey cringed. Sirens wailed, and Kelsey saw the alternating red and blue flash in her peripheral vision through the window. Donnie's eyes widened, and he shoved tiny desks aside as he crossed the room. He watched for a moment as another police car pulled into the parking lot, and then closed the blinds, plunging the classroom into shadow. Kelsey slowly repositioned herself between him and the students. "They came to my house, you know," he said. She nodded. "I know." "Because you called them," he said. "Told them I was stalking you." "Stalking you!" They questioned me. They questioned my mother. Told her I wouldn't stop calling you. She yelled at me." "I'm sorry," she said. "What kind of world is this?" he said. "Huh? Where a man can't tell a woman he loves her. I didn't do anything." "Donnie, please." "No," he shouted. "Shut up. I had a job. It was a good job. I liked it. Who's going to pay my mother's rent?" Kelsey tried to answer, but her mouth was dry. The arm holding the gun fell to his side, and he looked at the floor. "All I wanted was one date." The silence hung heavy between them. Finally, Kelsey found her voice. "All right." He looked up. "What?" She sucked in breath between her teeth and offered what she hoped was a caring smile. "I'll go out with you." His face brightened. "You will?" She nodded. "Just let the kids go outside and play so that we can talk." He stared, and then the rage washed over his face again. No, you're trying to trick me." She shook her head. "No, I'm not. Just please." He raised the gun, pointing it at her face. "Don't lie to me." The children screamed, and she fell back against the desk. "Kids, stay down." Donnie's face contorted, anguished as he stepped forward, leading with the gun, which had finally stopped trembling in his grip. The ceiling between them exploded inward with a shower of sparks as something heavy tore through a light fixture and struck the floor. Dust, insulation, and broken tiles rained down onto the crouched form of a person encased in a suit of blue and gray armor. Plaster dust swirled in the beam of light shining down onto the figure. Kelsey stared, mouth agape, as the figure stood, blocking her view of the equally shocked gunman. "Put the weapon down," the new arrival said, his voice synthesized but unmistakably male. Donnie stared. "I know you." The suited figure clenched his fists. "Oh, I doubt that very much, Cupcake." "I've seen you on TV." "Okay," the stranger admitted. "I can buy that." "It's the TDC," Kelsey whispered. Of course she'd seen them too. Who hadn't heard of the Terran Defense Corps? They'd been all over the news and social media for weeks. "Maybe you didn't understand me the first time," the TDC agent said. "I'll use smaller words. Drop the gun. The threat seemed to bolster Donnie's confidence, or, at the very least, convinced him he had nothing left to lose. He pointed the gun at the newcomer's blank, dark visor. Make me. The man scoffed. I thought you'd never ask. Donnie squeezed the trigger, firing 3 rounds in quick succession. The bullets rang as they struck the armor. The children screamed and Kelsey winced. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard 3 soft impacts. In the sunbeam, she saw 3 flattened lumps of smoking metal on the carpet. A TDC agent looked down at the bullets, as did Donnie. Slowly, the armored man looked up at the stunned gunman, clicking his tongue behind his faceplate. That's going to cost you, Cupcake. The cost is pretty steep. Donnie adjusted his aim and fired a wild shot at Kelsey. She screamed and covered her face with her arm, but the same resounding clang rang out as the bullet struck the TDC agent's outstretched hand. Donnie squeezed the trigger again, but the weapon only clicked. He tried again, but the result was the same. In the blink of an eye, the suited man crossed the distance between the gunman and himself. His fist connected with Donnie's face with a muffled crunch as his other hand encircled the spent weapon, crushing the hot metal in a vice-like grip. The impact threw Donnie off his feet, and he fell against toppled desks, unconscious even before he landed. The man in the suit regarded the hunk of twisted metal in his hand and dropped it. He looked over his shoulder. Are you all right? Kelsey nodded, unable to find the words. The rescuer pushed an overturned desk aside with his boot and knelt in front of the limp gunman, placing his fingers against his neck. Kelsey craned her neck for a better look. Is he dead? No, the man said, wrapping his fingers around Donnie's collar. But he'll wish he was. He stood, dragging the unconscious man behind him by the leg as he walked back into the front of the room. Unit 3 to command, he said. Target has been neutralized. After a moment, he added, negative, emergency responders on scene. He stepped into the sunbeam and looked up, his knees bent slightly. Kelsey scrambled to her feet and held up a hand. Thank you. The man paused and regarded her for a moment. He simply nodded. What's your name? He turned away, ignoring the question. Please, Kelsey said. The man hesitated. Finally, he said, it's Sam. Flames erupted from his boots, and the armored hero and his prisoner lifted into the air, disappearing through a hole in the ceiling. Fresh tears flowed from Kelsey's eyes as relief washed over her. Behind her, a tiny voice called out, Thank you, Sam. The voice was joined by another and another. Outside, she heard a muffled thump. She ran to the window and raised the blinds. A crowd of police, students, and onlookers swarmed one of the police cruisers. Donnie writhed on the hood, clutching his face. The man in the blue armor hovered above the car for a moment before igniting his boot thrusters and disappearing over the trees. Thank you, Sam, Kelsey said as she lost sight of him. Burlington, Iowa. I said, shut up and get on the ground, the man in the blue ski mask shouted. One by one, the bank patrons complied. An elderly man with a cane struggled to get down to his knees. You too, Grandpa, Blue said. Move your ass. A girl no older than 5 began to sob as her mother coaxed her down onto the floor with her. The mother stroked the child's hair and shushed her, tears welling in her eyes as the girl's sobs swelled into terrified wails. Shut that damn kid up, another man in a red ski mask shouted. The mother redoubled her efforts to soothe the child, but the girl's eyes remained fixed on the shotguns in the robber's hands, and she continued to cry. Red snarled and tossed a black drawstring bag onto the counter and gestured with the barrel of his pump-action 12-gauge. Fill it up, Red said. Try anything funny and I will blow your head off. The teller nodded and opened her drawer, scooping bills into the bag. She breathed deeply, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. Come on, Red said. Pick up the pace. The teller nodded and moved faster. When the drawer was empty, Red motioned with the gun, and she moved on to the next drawer. When all 3 drawers had been emptied into the bag, Red held out his hand. Come on, gimme, he said, wiggling his fingers impatiently. The teller placed the bag in his waiting hand and took 2 steps away from the counter, her hands in the air. "All right," Red said, "let's get out of here." Blue swept the room with his shotgun. "Eyes on the floor!" The doors at the front of the building exploded inward, spreading glass shards across the floor, along with the body of a man wearing a dark brown jacket and a black ski mask. The man slid to a halt in the middle of the lobby. The startled bank patrons screamed, and the robbers instinctively trained their guns on the unconscious man. "Holy crap," Blue said. "What the hell happened to Nate?" "No names, you idiot," Red hissed. "Nate had a little car trouble," a synthesized voice said. The robbers looked up as a man in gleaming white and gray armor stepped through the ruined door. A bundle of black wires dangled from his fist. The new arrival tossed the wires, which were connected to a chunk of black plastic. They landed at Blue's feet. "I'm no expert," the armored man said, "but I think it's the distributor cap." "Jesus," Blue said. The helmeted head shook. Afraid not." "It's one of those robots from that school," Blue said. The armored man's shoulders slumped. "Why does everyone think we're robots?" Red dropped the bag and dragged one of the frightened patrons to her feet. The woman protested in Spanish, but the robber grabbed a fistful of her hair and held the shotgun barrel beneath her chin. "Stay back," he said. "I'll shoot this broad." The man in the white armor took a step forward. "You're not going to shoot her." Red's arm relaxed, and the shotgun dipped slightly. "I'm not going to shoot her. You're going to let her leave." Red released the woman and shoved her toward the door. "You can leave." The woman stared, stunned for a moment. The armored man nodded, and she ran for the door, muttering under her breath. "Hey!" Blue leveled his shotgun at the fleeing woman. "Where do you think you're—" The man in armor held up his left hand, palm out toward Blue, and the robber flipped his shotgun up, pointed at his own chin. "Oh, God!" he bellowed. "Joe! Joe, help!" Red stared dumbly at the man in the armor, as if he had not heard his partner's desperate pleas. "I'm afraid Joe's not home right now," the man in armor said. "All right, everyone, you're free to go." Red, Joe, began to move toward the door, but the man in white held up his other hand. "No," he said, "not you, Joe. I want you to keep your friend covered for me. Can you do that for me?" Joe turned and trained his gun on Blue, who was straining against the invisible hold on his arms. Slowly, hesitantly, the patrons got to their feet and made their way to the door, each of them glancing at the frozen robbers. "Attaboy," the man in armor said. "Joe!" Blue wailed. "What the hell are you doing? Shoot him!" As the mother and little girl walked past, the man in the armor held out his hand, palm out. The girl looked at the metal hand, uncertain, and then finally slapped her own palm against it. "Ow!" the man in the armor said, shaking his hand in the air. "Not so hard. I bruise easy." She giggled. "Thank you," the girl's mother whispered. The man nodded. When the last of the hostages had stepped through the demolished doors, the man in white armor approached the robbers. Sweat dripped from Blue's eyebrows. His hand trembled as he stared at his own weapon. "Now, boys," the man said, "I want you to stay just like that until the police arrive. And then I want you to do exactly what they tell you. Do you understand?" "Yes," Joe said, his voice an emotionless drone. "Yes," Blue said. I promise." "Good," the man in armor said. "Very good." He left the men frozen in place, then knelt to pick up the black bag on the floor. With a flourish, he presented it to the astonished teller. "Nothing to worry about, ma'am," he said. "Everything's going to be just..." A cloud of pink vapor poured from the mesh bag, covering the hero's chest and face, along with the teller, who stared at the bag, mouth agape, in bright pink dye. The man in the armor sighed. "Fine." Minneapolis, Minnesota. Ron Atkins blinked away the dust stinging his eyes and called out into the darkness. Is anyone there? Countless sounds reached his ears, but not one of them sounded like a human voice. A car alarm blared somewhere to his right, the vehicle's lights bathing the area in fleeting moments of alternating light and darkness. Water cascaded down from above. Or was it? He thought he smelled gasoline, but that could be coming from any of the smashed cars around him. Hello? He called again. Dust invaded his lungs, and he coughed. The motion jarred his entire body, sending new spikes of pain through his leg. He looked down at the offending limb, his eyes traveling along his dust-coated trousers until they disappeared beneath a concrete pillar. He tried again to pull it free, but his foot did not budge. Tears cut through trails through the dust, coating his cheeks. Suddenly a new sound reached his ears, a pounding. In the distance, rhythmic impacts brought down new showers of dust. They'd come for him. Help, he shouted, his voice already hoarse from hours of trying. I'm here! The pounding ceased, and a small explosion rocked the structure, bathing him in a brilliant emerald flash. He held his breath as a cloud of concrete dust and smoke washed over him. Jesus, a woman said. Don't do that again. Perhaps it was the echo, but her voice sounded strange, distorted. Ron craned his neck, straining to look in the direction of the sounds. Twin beams of light cut through the swirling gloom, which were soon followed by another pair, as someone dropped through a rough hole in the ceiling. Can you hear me? A male voice called, similarly distorted. I hear you, Ron shouted. I'm here. Immediately, the lights fell on him. He blinked away tears as the figures made their way over and around the debris to him. In the alternating light, he saw that they weren't firemen at all. Their bodies were encased in gleaming metallic armor. The larger of the two was clad in red and dark gray. A red cross set in a white circle decorated his shoulder. The same symbol adorned the smaller figure's armor, which was black and gold. Oh my God, Ron said. You're here to help, said the woman in gold. He's pinned, the man in red said. Right leg, mid-tibia. The woman dimmed the light shining from the sides of her helmet and looked at Ron. Can you move your toes? Ron tried. He'd tried before with painful results. Now he felt nothing but cold. I don't know. A groan echoed throughout the structure. Dust rained down, and small chunks of concrete struck the newcomer's armor. We need to move him, the man said. This place could come down around us any minute. Ron coughed. The woman in gold placed her hands on her helmet and felt along the collar. There was a sharp hiss, and she lifted the helmet. The man grabbed her arm. Cherry, what are you doing? He needs oxygen, the woman said, her voice soft and concerned without the helmet synthesizer to disguise it. In the gloom, Ron looked into the worried face of a woman with brilliant green eyes and short auburn hair. You are human, Ron said. He'd heard rumors. Ever since the TDC had appeared on the scene a few months ago, television and the internet had been abuzz with wild speculation. Some claimed they were a secret military unit. Others thought they were robots. A few even claimed they were a myth, some kind of public relations dog and pony show put on by the government, complete with crisis actors playing disaster victims. There was something in the woman's expression. Disgust? Had he said something wrong? I'm going to put this on you, she said. It'll help you breathe. Ron nodded and lifted his head to allow Cherry to slip the helmet over his head. He was plunged into absolute darkness. You'll feel a pinch, she said. As if on cue, the helmet's collar contracted, forming an airtight seal around Ron's neck. He felt a slight prick at the back of his neck and winced as images and strings of numbers sprang onto the visor in front of his eyes. Finally, the scrolling digits resolved into his blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, and a slew of other numbers he couldn't begin to interpret. I've got his vitals, the man in red said, adjusting oxygen levels. The images retreated to the upper right corner of the visor, and Cherry's face appeared in Ron's vision, illuminating a soft green that made her eyes appear to glow. Hang tight. Just breathe normally, she said. She turned to her companion. Can we move it? He grunted. Not without cutting. It's wedge tight. Get to it. Look away, the man ordered. A bright emerald light flared in the darkness, and the visor automatically dimmed to protect Ron's vision. Cold metal fingers gripped and cradled his trembling hand. Still with me? Ron nodded, the motion difficult with the helmet weighing him down. Your name's Cherry? That's different. The woman nodded. Best if we keep that between us, huh? Ron nodded. Of course. What's your name? Ron? Okay, Ron, Cherry said. Can you tell me what happened? Ron swallowed and licked his cracked lips, tasting the dust coating them. I was walking to my car. I came to the mall to buy my daughter a present for her birthday. I was going to see her tonight. Now I guess that's not happening. You say that like you don't see her often. Her mother and I are separated, he explained. I haven't seen Melissa in 3 weeks. She hasn't been sleeping well, so I decided to buy her one of those new teddy bears everyone's so crazy for. You know, the Nighty Nights? Cherry nodded. Except I lost the bag when the building collapsed, Ron said. I don't suppose you see it around, do you? Cherry shook her head. No, but we're going to give Melissa something even better than a new bear. We're going to bring her daddy home. Fresh tears welled in Ron's eyes. He wished he could believe her. What happened? Cherry's jaw clenched. We think it was a bomb. Ron sighed. Static crackled in Ron's ears. 001, this is Unit 5. I copy, said the man in red, still cutting. I found a second device in the mall, the voice said. Don't worry, it failed to go off. I've neutralized it. Good work, the man said. We're almost done here. See you outside. Unit 1 out. Cherry turned to her companion. What did he say? There was another bomb inside the mall. Luckily it was a dud, the man said. I'm almost through. Get ready. Ron winced and grunted as Cherry slid her armored hands beneath his knees and back. Okay, Ron, this is going to hurt like hell. As soon as your leg is free, I'm going to pull you clear. You ready? Ron nodded. Almost there, the man said. A groan echoed throughout the structure, and dust rained down in thick, billowing clouds. A chunk of concrete struck the ground beside Ron's head and cracked in half. We have to go, Cherry said. 5 more seconds, her companion hissed. Cherry shoved him aside. There's no time! The armor covering her forearm split open, revealing a small cannon. She swiped her arm across the pinned leg, and a bright green flash briefly illuminated the area. Searing pain coursed through Ron's leg, and he screamed, the helmet's voice synthesizer converting him to a harsh, digitized shriek. In the dying light, he caught a brief glimpse of a smoking stump. Tiny flames danced along his trousers' severed threads. The display inside the helmet flashed like a Christmas tree. A section of the ceiling fell away, and Cherry stepped over Ron's chest to intercept it. The concrete slab struck her armored shoulders with a ringing clang as sparks rained down on Ron. He closed his eyes, preparing for the impact that would snuff his life out, but when he opened his eyes, the armored woman still stood above him, the concrete balanced on her arms. Get out, she gasped. The man in the red armor reached for her. I can help. A second rumble shook the structure, and something struck the slab from above, making Cherry's knees buckle slightly under the added weight. Ron trembled, the pain in his leg forgotten. Cherry gritted her teeth and glowered at her partner, her eyes a glowing, radioactive green. Fly! The man in red scooped Ron up in his arms and ignited the thrusters in the suit's ankles. Ron's stomach lurched as they left the ground, and debris and twisted wrecks streaked past his vision. The man in red twisted in midair, propelling them through the rough hole through which they'd come. They swerved, avoiding a tumbling pickup truck. Ron watched the vehicle plummet until it disappeared in a cloud of dust. His rescuer twisted again and brought them back on a roughly horizontal course. The floor below them slanted, and the man in the suit adjusted their angle, heading for the blinding sunlight pouring through a rough opening at the opposite end of the structure. All around them, cars and trucks lost the battle with gravity and slid down the steep slope as the parkade continued to crumble. Hang on, the man in red shouted. Ron looked ahead just in time to see a dark blue SUV tumbling toward them. its alarm barely piercing the deafening rumble. Ron screamed as the man in armor rolled out of the way, and for a fleeting moment, the SUV's alarm drowned out the roar before fading again into nothingness. Their path unobstructed, the flying man put on a burst of speed, and they emerged into the open air, free of the collapsing structure. Crisp, clean air chilled Ron's skin, and he looked back as the man carrying him slowed and hovered. They watched as the parking garage, already broken, crumbled and fell in upon itself. "Cheryl!" the man in red bellowed. An enormous billowing cloud completely obscured the rubble. Ron's heart sank as he realized the woman had just given her life for his. Before he could dwell on his newfound grief, however, the man in red ignited his thrusters again, and Ron's body jerked as they plunged toward the ground. Ron had ridden a roller coaster once when he was 10 years old, and this felt exactly like that. His eyes grew wide as the ground surged up at them, but before they could strike the earth, the man decreased their speed and came to a gentle, jogging landing near a fleet of ambulances. Ron's stomach slowly settled as the armored man ran toward the nearest of the vehicles and lowered him onto an empty gurney. Ron's back had barely sunk into the soft cushion before he felt the cold, armored fingers clawing at his neck. The helmet's collar detached its hold with a soft hiss, and unfiltered sunlight bathed Ron's sweat-beaded face. He looked down at the still smoking stump of his right shin. The man followed his gaze and offered a hasty, "I'm sorry." Ron shook his head. "She saved my life. The armored man stepped away from the gurney as two paramedics approached and began administering to Ron. "Cherry," he said. Suddenly, a similarly clad figure encased in matte black armor landed at the red man's side. Immediately noticing the gold and black helmet in his comrade's hands, the newcomer snatched it away and in heavily accented English said, "Where is Cheryl?" "Renee," the man in red's shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry." The man in black turned toward the collapsed parkade and fell to his knees. "No." The man in red reached out to touch Renee's shoulder, but pulled back, startled when his companion punched the ground, leaving a crater in the asphalt. "I'm so sorry." Renee's hands flew to his faceplate and he wailed, a sound only made more tragic by the suit's synthesizer. Ron stared, unable to look away from the grief his salvation had caused. Another explosion shook the ground, and the two grieving men snapped their heads up, directing their gaze toward the leveled parkade where a new plume of smoke and dust blossomed. Ron craned his neck for a better look, fighting against the medic trying to strap an oxygen mask over his face. Two pinpoints of emerald light pierced the haze, and a dark shape slowly came into view within the cloud. After a few seconds, a lone figure lurched into the open air. Her hair was matted with sweat and dust, and her face covered in blood. Cherry limped away from the rubble, her eyes gleaming. Halfway across the street, she stopped and shook her left leg. She grunted in pain, tested the limb, and resumed walking, seemingly unhindered by her injuries. Ron's breath caught in his throat as he watched her stalk toward her astonished comrades. The men met her halfway. "My sheriff!" Renee gasped. The other man reached toward her. "Are you—" "I'm fine, Lamont," Cherry said, snatching her helmet from his hand. She shook her matted hair and lowered the helmet over her head. Her chest plate moved as she took in a deep breath of purified oxygen. "Let's get the hell out of here," she said. "You heard the lady," Lamont said. Renee and Lamont bent their knees and pushed off the ground, jet exhaust trailing behind them. Cherry readied herself to follow. "Wait!" Ron shouted, pulling the oxygen mask down. Cherry paused and looked at him. She nodded and launched herself into the air. Ron watched until he could no longer see the glint of her armor. Finally, he settled back and let exhaustion overtake him. "Thank you," he whispered. There we go.
Sounds good.
What do you guys say? You like it?
I'm liking it. It's catching my attention.
I'm a little confused on if they're robots or they.
They are okay. Um, a couple of them are human. A couple of them are an immortal variation, like mutation of humans,
Okay.
and three of them are shape-shifting aliens. They're the Replodians that the Mongolians and the Russian were talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a team of 7
Okay.
of them. Yeah,
I think I caught 5 of them.
yeah. 2 of them are on a different mission somewhere.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is this your newest book?
Yeah. Yeah, about 3/4 done with it.
Okay.
And got the cover art here, actually.
It's nice.
That is nice.
Same guy that did the Birthright and Weller 2
Okay.
covers. He's amazing. His name's Puppeteer Lee, and he does work for Heavy Metal Magazine, DC Comics,
Okay.
Image Comics. There's a couple new Spawn series that Image is putting out, and he did some covers for those.
Cool.
So yeah, I've been bragging for a couple months now. My cover guy does Spawn. I had to get the first cover he did for him, and I need to get like a UV protected comic book frame so I can hang it up. But yeah,
That sounds pretty cool.
yeah, he is awesome. Whew. It has a long first chapter. It's so long. But yeah, I keep pushing the release date back. I kept saying it was going to be ready for Christmas, and then I was like, no, it's not going to be in time for Christmas. Okay, it's going to be for DemiCon. Crap, DemiCon's here. Fall?
That's how it goes sometimes, right?
Yeah. Well, I've had a couple people ask me. It's like, so you had about 2.5 years of quarantine, man. What you got for me? I ain't got a damn.
We've been having a lot of writer's block.
A lot of writer's block. A lot like we were homeschooling our 2 boys, and my father was a teacher and a public school administrator for 30 years. So, and my sister has been a teacher. So, education is in my blood, but apparently it skipped me. I'm not good at it. Especially math. I cannot do math. So like, so my wife would have to do all the math stuff with him, but like all the English stuff I was able to help him with, and but the way our school was doing the distance learning thing over the computer, they were really crappy systems. I didn't like it. It was just really stressful, and it wound up being nothing. But for a while, we thought that our youngest had asthma, and so that would put him at a higher COVID risk, and so there was that fear, and the school was trying to, like, we were only like one of like 2 or 3 families that was doing distance learning. It's a really small district that we're in, it's a rural district, and so they were really trying to pressure us to come back to in-person learning, and it's like no, I stood firm, and like I think Scott was only one of 2 elementary kids that was actually out. And but when it turned out it wasn't asthma. Basically, he just had really poor posture, and the doctor did all the tests. Like, yeah, you don't have asthma. You just need to sit up straight.
Yeah, make sure that airflow is open.
Yeah, make sure that get your airways open. Yeah, but yeah, I refused until they approved the vaccine for his age group. I refused to let them go back, but yeah, they got to go back for 2nd semester, and even though they both hate school, they like in-person school a hell of a lot better than the homeschooling. And we had to put our elderly dog down at the beginning of the week. He was 15 years old, and his kidneys suddenly failed overnight, and so that was all she wrote for him. But he's had like urinary problems for the past couple of years. So like I always had to stay close to him, and and he had mobility issues, so he couldn't like go down the stairs to my office or anything. So I always have to stick around to make sure that he didn't pee on the floor or something like that. Now he's no longer with us, so that'll kind of free me up to be able to actually go down to the office and work now. But yeah, there was a whole lot of different contributing factors, and I just had horrible, crippling anxiety about the boys getting sick and whatnot. So yeah, it wasn't a very good working environment for me. But yeah, hopefully I can, put my nose to the grind and get War Machines out so I can start working on
Some other things.
some other projects. It's funny, like everybody keeps coming up to me in Dio's room saying, when are we going to get the sequel to that? And it's like, as soon as I get done with the sequel to that. Okay, what about a sequel to that? As soon as I get done with the sequel to that and then the sequel to that, And they're like, oh, what about this other project, this standalone project you were working on? Son of a bitch, I don't know where that is in the rotation, guys. It's like, you'll get it when you get it. Yeah, the dumbest thing I ever did was starting multiple series. I really should have just done one series and stuck with it. But this book, the one that this is a sequel to, Birthright, was the second book I ever wrote, but it was actually the third book that I published. And then the first book I ever wrote is like the most recent one that I published. It stayed in a drawer forever, and I finally got to a point after 20 years where I liked it and could put it out. But then, of course, Weller is so damn popular. Everybody loves Weller. Well, I never intended that to be a series. It was supposed to just be a standalone short story. And then the editor that published it had said, hey, we'd really like you to do this as a full-length novel for us. And I was like, all right. And it took off. And I was like, more Weller. And it's like, okay. So yeah, I had this series that I never realized was gonna be a series. So now I'm juggling 3 series at the same time. And it's the dumbest decision I could have ever made as a writer. But I'll make it work. I swear I will.
Well, there's at least one author where I've been waiting 10 years for them to come out with something new. Just anything new. I don't even care what it is. Just anything new from that author.
Oh, I've gotten compared to George R. R. Martin a couple times this weekend. And it's like, oh, please don't do that to me. I'm not that bad, I promise.
I'm reading through all the Game of Thrones books right now.
Yeah. I have never read them.
I say I'm reading them. I'm listening to them on audiobook.
Oh, that's valid.
Yeah.
That counts. Xavier is really big into the series, and I had no idea what it was about. And he was on the 3rd book when the series aired on HBO for the first time. And he was like, "Can I watch the show?" He was in 6th grade.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah.
They're like, "Can I watch the show?" And Jess was like, "Well, it's HBO, so why don't you let us?" Because we were True Blood fans, and they really spiced up True Blood for HBO.
Yeah.
And he's like, "Why don't we check it out first?" We watched the first episode, and as soon as the credits rolled, I'm like, "Oh God!" And I run upstairs and open his door, and he's sitting there with his nose buried in book 3. And I go, "So, son, those Game of Thrones books, is there a lot of sex and stuff in those?" And he goes, "No, Dad, nothing I've seen so far." And I'm like, "All right, good. And then later, the next day, he went up to his mom, and he's like, "So, Mom, I lied to Dad. He asked me if there was any sex in the books, and I said no, because I didn't want him to take the books away," which I wouldn't have. We would have just had to talk, I read stuff when I was in 6th grade that would have curled my parents' toes if they knew. But he's like, but I really, really like the books, and I skip over the sex parts anyway. And at first I was like, yeah, sure. But as he's 21 years old now, and as I've gotten to know him more, it's like, Yeah, you know what? I actually strongly believe it. 'Cause he has never said anything on the subject, but I'm pretty sure he's ace.
Okay.
So I'm pretty sure he's like, oh, they're doing it again. Yay, they're killing people again. I'm pretty sure that's how he reads Game of Thrones.